Awesome. Well, we'll get started. This is something we've been working on for quite some time. An opportunity to have this nutrition conversation for athletes. It's something that I think that many athletes at multiple levels can benefit from because of its the way you've designed it, the base, the foundation, and then the thinking through it. It's not something that is specified for any one specific level. I think it's foundational. I think that's what's great about it. So I'm excited for you to take us through it and teach us, lead us in your ways. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get started.
Amazing. Thank you. Today we're going to be talking about some sports nutrition 101 and how to fuel athletes, just like Brad mentioned, of any sport, any level to peak performance. So really talking about those sports nutrition foundations. Before I get into it, I do want to introduce myself. My name is Kirsten Bohnenberger. I am a sports dietitian. I've previously worked with athletes at the University of Virginia, Florida State University, the Boston Celtics, as well as continue to work with athletes at George Mason University, a local Virginia university. And with all that experience, I've developed these kind of foundational guidelines for sports nutrition. And my first question before we get into it is to give you a moment to think about what impacts food decisions. When you think about what you want to eat, when you open up the fridge, what are you thinking through and what's impacting those decisions? It might be something like taste or cost or how much time you have or what cooking skills you have available or what cooking appliances work best for you. And our goal with this presentation is not to be the only decision and driving factor when you make food choices, but it's to add a sports nutrition lens, to add that lens of how do you fuel to maximize your performance within some of those other factors that you might have thought of with this question, like taste preference or cost. So I'm hoping that within some of the foundations we talk about today, you're able to make choices that still fit with all these other factors you might be thinking of, but add in what fueling for optimal performance looks like. So, why is sports nutrition important before we dive in? When I think about why sports nutrition is important, I think of several factors. Our very first one is for energy. Food provides fuel to perform both all of the activities we need to do our day-to-day life, walk around, do anything and everything, but also that extra level of performance, whether we are doing recovery, whether we are doing weightlifting, we're doing a high intensity practice, our body is going to need energy to fuel all of the spectrum of activities that we do, and food is going to provide that fuel. So that is first and foremost. Our second aspect of why sports nutrition is important for athletes is it helps us provide mental focus and keeps our brain running in the way that we would like it to. And that can be related to if you're a student athlete, it's going to help you ensure that you can stay focused and perform well in your studies or on your exams. But also when you think of all of the decisions you might make in a particular sports game or competition. If you are a football player, there is 1,000 different small decisions that you're going to be making during a game, and having your brain be as focused and running as well as it can is going to be important to make effective and smart decisions on the field. Our third reason is one that many athletes are acquainted with, is that adequate energy and adequate nutrition is going to help support and grow our muscles. So for many of us who, again, are engaging in weightlifting, progressive overload, the food that we eat will directly impact our ability to support the muscle we already have, but also continue to grow the muscles that we may be hoping to support our performance long term. Reason number 4 is going to be recovery. While we love sports nutrition to provide us energy, to give our brain mental focus, and to support and grow our muscles, we also need fuel and nutrition to recover from exercise and allow us to practice hard on a Thursday and be back out on the field on a Friday, feeling the best that we can feel. So recovery is going to be an important aspect of sports nutrition. And then The last reason, and possibly my most favorite reason, is that having adequate fuel and hydration reduces the likelihood that we will become injured. As many of my mentors have said, the best ability is availability. So we can be able to practice on the field. That is always going to be supportive for our long-term performance, and fueling and hydrating enough reduces the likelihood that we may become injured in the future. It can't prevent it entirely, but we can give ourselves the best chance to be available all season long. So those are some of the reasons that sports nutrition is going to be important moving forward. Into the basics that I've promised. The model that I use to talk about sports nutrition and elaborate on how we're going to prioritize what's most important for us as athletes is called the performance pyramid. And so we're going to walk through this entire pyramid from bottom to top throughout this presentation and talk a little bit more about what adequacy and hydration may mean, what balance, consistency, and timing might mean for us as athletes. That being said, our foundation is going to be adequacy and hydration. And when I think of adequacy and hydration, what I mean by adequacy is having enough fuel, enough food to do all the things that we need to do, both within sport and outside of sport. So having enough energy to accomplish what we're hoping to. And when I think of hydration, we think of the fluids that we have every day, water, sports drinks, anything along those lines, and how to optimally hydrate or optimally consume fluids in a way that works well for us. So we're going to start with our hydration element of our foundation. And why is hydration important? Hydration is really important for both athletes and non-athletes alike because greater than 1% loss of fluid or body water, the water that we keep in our body to perform all of our basic functions, can lead to decreases in energy, decreases in speed, decrease in mental focus, like we talked about when we talked about why sports nutrition might be important for us as athletes. It can lead to a decrease in muscle strength, an increase in RPE, which means rate of perceived exertion. And essentially all that means is how hard you feel like you're working. So if you're in a hydrated body doing a practice that feels an 8 out of 10 difficulty, if 10 is the most difficult, if you would do that same practice in a dehydrated state, that might feel like a 10 out of 10 difficulty. So ensuring that our rate of perceived exertion or rate of perceived effort matches what we are actually experiencing versus being exacerbated by being in a dehydrated state. And then last but not least, being in a state of dehydration increases our injury risk, which again, like we talked about, is something that we're always hoping to avoid when we can. So those are a couple of reasons why hydration is important. How do we know when we might be feeling dehydrated? Some of the signs of dehydration that you may experience as an athlete can include the following. It can be muscle cramps or increased muscle cramping. It will be that sensation of thirst. It could be lightheadedness, dizziness, particularly when you stand up. It will look like infrequent or darker urine. It can look like more frequent constipation. It could look like increased irritability or confusion. Back when we think about that mental focus piece, we might feel like our brain isn't functioning as clearly. We could get headaches more often, and we'll also likely experience lower energy and fatigue. So if you're starting to experience one or a few of these signs, that may be something to think about when we think about how we're hydrating before, during, and after competition, but also in our day-to-day life. So those are some of our warning signs that our body is already in a relatively dehydrated state. To expand upon the ways that you can navigate what hydration looks like for you, my favorite tool is our urine color scale. And we've identified kind of 3 areas that you may want to be when you go to the restroom. We have our green box here. So that's going to be a really pale yellow, or kind of a light lemonade is sometimes what it's called. We have our yellow box here, which is really starting to get towards that dehydrated space. And that's going to be darker yellow. And then we get these 6, 7, and 8, which are going to be really dark yellow, almost to that apple juice-like color. So whenever we can, we want to be mostly staying in this 2 to 3 zone. So it doesn't have to be completely clear, but that really pale or really light yellow is what we might be aiming for on a day-to-day basis to indicate to us that we're staying hydrated. Once we start seeing these 4, 5, 6, 7, 8s, we want to think about increasing our hydration, making sure we're grabbing water, a sports beverage, whatever our preferred fluids are. So
Can I
those are
pause
some
you
of,
for a question,
yeah,
Kirsten? So
absolutely.
on one of the previous slides, you were talking about adequacy, right? And if you look at this scale, is too much a problem too? Are you flushing out minerals? Are you, if it's a 1 on this scale here, if we move past adequacy for performance and move to too much, too overhydrated, a situation such as that, is that probably not much of a problem, but is it still a problem?
Yep, that's a great question. So, yeah, the reason that 1 doesn't fall into our lovely green box here is that 1, like you mentioned, is almost an overhydrated state. Again, it's not likely to produce any immediate adverse effects necessarily, but we do want to see that kind of balance where if we might see this 1 every so often, but if our urine is consistently this color, it might mean that we're overhydrated or perhaps hydrating a little bit too much. Versus, again, if we're seeing a little bit more of a spectrum, that's a much different story. So yes, you can kind of consistently be in this overhydrated state that we may be wanting to avoid long term. So that's a great question.
Yeah, thank you.
Gorgeous. So our signs of dehydration, what we might be looking for, both feeling physically, like on this slide, what we may be looking at urine color standpoint. So how do we reach adequacy in hydration and try to get ourselves in this 2 to 3 most of the time? And as a preface, the guidelines I'm going to talk about are general guidelines. Certainly, if you're looking for individualized or personalized guidelines, I highly recommend talking with a sports dietitian who can really personalize these. But from a very, very general perspective, when we think about what staying hydrated looks like for athletes, we think about our minimum foundation for the day. And for most people, you can take your weight in pounds and divide it by 2. And that might roughly give you an estimate of, on a day that you're doing no activity at all, not sweating consistently, what might be adequate for you. And for those of us who are engaging in exercise regularly, we want to add on to that foundational piece. So for example, if we are 220 pounds, that might look like 110 ounces of water as a foundational step. We want to add on to that to account for the exercise that we'll be doing, the fact that we're probably sweating more, losing more water during those times. And generally, we recommend having at least 16 to 32 ounces of water or fluid before exercise, trying our best to achieve 8 to 16 ounces every 30 minutes if we can. Certainly this isn't always possible, particularly for my sports like swimming, where it may be harder to access fluids if you're in a pool, but doing the best we can to reach somewhere towards this. And then capping our exercise with another 16 to 32 ounces of water. So that might be a half to a full Gatorade bottle that's depicted in this image. So again, these are relatively general guidelines. Certainly, if you're looking for personalized, individualized recommendations, a sports dietitian is someone who is able to provide you with this. But from a zoomed out lens to get us a foundation or a starting point, these are some general recommendations that you can follow to try and look at what amount of fluids will make you feel hydrated and get you to that adequate hydration that we're talking about.
Can I ask one more question here?
Absolutely.
Kirsten? So, a lot of programs will weigh before and after activity. So let's say you have a practice, 2-hour practice, your weight going in. That doesn't speak to necessarily that what minimum you need per day, right? If an athlete hasn't shown up to practice properly hydrated, we don't know that necessarily, okay? But we can know, or any athlete can know, any coach can know, if an athlete has dropped 3 pounds during a practice with a pre and post practice, that they're down 3 pounds. And one of the things that I've always been taught by your world is that per pound post practice is roughly 20 ounces of water. Is that an accurate number when I look at your numbers here?
Yep, absolutely. So that's a great tool that some programs have access to. These recommendations on my right are potentially for someone who doesn't have that information, yep. But certainly if you're able to get more accurate insight, which might come from weighing pre and post practice, certainly again, always being mindful to try and weigh in similar clothing, not weigh in a wet and sweaty jersey or anything like that. But we typically would want to rehydrate with 16-ish to 24 ounces of fluids per pound loss, if that's data that your program is collecting. So that 20 ounces is kind of right in that middle, but we often see that range. So absolutely. And if I had the choice between using that data or using, again, these more general guidelines, I would go with those more personalized recommendations that might reflect what's going on in the individual a little bit better than some of these general guidelines can. Mm-hmm. But that's a great question. Gorgeous. Any other questions about hydration generally?
Not right now, no.
All righty. Lovely. So that is going to make up our hydration foundation of the day. The next aspect of our foundational level of our pyramid is adequacy from a food and fueling perspective. So we've covered hydration. Let's take a look at what adequacy might start to mean from a food perspective. And first and foremost, just to get us all on the same page, I want to chat a little bit about our nutrition team, which is going to be our protein, carbohydrates, fat, and I call them color. It just means our fruits and vegetables. So our 3 major macronutrient groups, those protein, carbs, and fat, and I add a 4th group in here called color to get an idea of what our fruits and vegetables, where they might fall within the greater picture of our nutrition for sport. And each one of these groups is going to serve a function that benefits athletes specifically. So first and foremost, we have our protein category, and protein, like we talked about when we talked about why sports nutrition might be important, protein is going to be a building block for growth and repair for our muscles. So maintaining our muscle mass, growing, repairing after exercise, whether that is weightlifting specifically or a different type of exercise, protein is really going to play a role in that. And the other aspect of protein that's interesting for athletes is that protein also typically helps us feel full. So when we think of wanting to feel satisfied after our meals, typically having a protein element in our meals and our snacks might help us feel that satisfaction or that fullness more so than including just one food group might. So that is protein, our building block for our muscles. Secondarily, we have our carbohydrates, and carbohydrates have 2 main functions. One of them is to provide immediate energy, and the other is to provide sustained energy. So when we think of where we get energy from, again, post practice, these are things that we're going to think about. And we'll talk a little bit more about what immediate versus sustained energy looks like in future slides when we talk about nutrient timing. But for now, carbohydrates are energy. Our 3rd macronutrient is macronutrient fat. And fat is going to help us store energy in our body to be used later, which is always helpful. And fat also is going to play a role in a lot of our essential body functions. So an example of that is we have 4 vitamins that are called fat-soluble vitamins. And that's a big word essentially for the fact that we need fat to help absorb these vitamins enough. And those can be vitamins like vitamins A, vitamins D, vitamins E, and vitamins K. So having enough fat as a macronutrient, which may come from things like avocado, olive oils, coconuts, nuts, and seeds, will help us ensure we absorb all of those vitamins, but also do things like adequately produce hormones and different things like that. So fat has a lot of important functions. And my final group, that isn't necessarily a macronutrient group, but I talk about just because it makes it a little bit easier to communicate about, is color. That can be any fruit and vegetable that you prefer: tomatoes, papayas, pomegranates, lettuce, whatever you can think of and that you enjoy can fall into this category if it is considered a fruit or a vegetable. And our color component from an athletic perspective is really going to support our recovery and decrease the inflammation in our body because this group tends to be really high in vitamins and minerals and antioxidants specifically. So from a recovery perspective, from a managing inflammation in our body, we see a lot of advantage in this particular group. And from a more general perspective, our color category will also support us in having enough fiber in our day, and that will help keep us regular, for lack of a better word, kind of keep everything moving in the direction we're hoping to, and help us feel full throughout our meals and our snacks for the day. So those are our 4 categories: protein, carbs, fat, and color. Again, examples can range of whatever you prefer. Our proteins will look like our meats, our seafood, eggs, our low-fat dairy products can fall in our protein column as well. We'll see our carbohydrates represented as things like pastas, bread, potatoes, granola bars, oatmeal, anything along those lines. And like I mentioned, our fats will be our oils, our avocados, our coconuts, our nuts and seeds, and colors are our fruit and veg. And they all serve a different function for our body and for our purposes as an athlete. So those are our categories. And now, how do we think about including those categories in our meals based on what activity we might have done that day? So when I think of a rest day, so a day that we are not doing any intentional activity for sport, we think about creating a plate that might look something like this. It's about 50-ish% of our color category, our fruits and our vegetables, about 25% carbohydrates, so our pastas, our breads, our potatoes, our oatmeal, and about 25% protein. So our chicken, our beef, our seafood, our tuna, our low-fat dairy will all fall into that category. And we also see our fats in this little circle right down here. And it's not because they're not important. It's because we tend to get our fat intake predominantly through cooking methods. So when we think about baking vegetables, we often put them in an olive oil or an avocado oil. And so we will get fat typically through cooking methods or kind of additions like adding peanut butter on top of something or nuts and seeds. So they are important, but they often are a little bit easier to get in a meal than these other major groups that we might need more of in quantity. So this is a rest day. Knowing what you know about our food groups, and I'll pop them back up here. We have protein, carbohydrates, fat, and color. When we think about increasing our intentional physical activity for the day, I'm curious if you take a moment to reflect what you think might change about this plate. So if we are going to do more activity and maybe need more energy, what might change about this plate?
Well, the first thing would be carbs because of the quick energy that they provide from your chart. But I assume protein also, I know it's a building block, but I assume that is part of the increase as well.
That is, you're pretty much on the money. I love that comment about energy. Our, say, a moderate training day, we're going to see the biggest increase in our carbohydrates. We see about, again, a third-ish of every component reflected. So moving from this 50% color, 25% protein, 25% carbohydrate to, again, 33-ish% color, carbohydrates, and protein. So a little bit more of an even split, but with that carbohydrate column being the most important from an increased perspective to replenish and both provide that energy that we're going to need for activity. So we see that change. Our fats, again, kind of stay the same down here, but we'll see these major macronutrient groups really change to accommodate and support that extra energy we may need to perform all the activities that we're hoping to perform. And then going off of that, on a hard training day, we're going to see that same increase happen again. So on a day that we're training the hardest, we're going to see about 50% of our plate become carbohydrates. So that oatmeal, crackers, granola bars, bread, pasta, anything along those lines become 50% of our plate. We'll change our color, our fruits, and our vegetables to about 25% of our plate, and we'll keep protein at about 25-30% of our plate as well, because we want that consistent consistent protein to support our muscles, but without replenishing the energy we're expending, it's going to be hard to save that protein and to use that protein to support our muscles when it may need to be used as energy if we don't have enough fuel for that particular day. And our fruits and our vegetables certainly are still going to continue to be important. But because, like we talked about before, our fruits and our vegetables can contribute to that feeling of fullness and may impact our ability to get enough energy, they take a little bit of a smaller role relative to our other nutrients on a really hard training day. Any questions about our performance plates?
I will say this, the one thing that I really want to point out is, like, when I look at all of the images, even from your very first slide, there are no protein bars. There's no shake. There's no, everything is a natural food. Everything is, now that might intimidate some people that it's that way because the other is quick. It's easy. People tend to pick that stuff up. But, I would, maybe this is a conversation for another time, but I would suggest and say, and from experience, both with athletes and personally, that once you develop a process, a consistent process of building these plates as you see it, and having the resources available, it's cheaper, it's better for you, it's just as easy. I get that there's some food preparation that's different than just pulling a protein bar out of a convenience store, but bottom line is that you got to drive to the convenience store, you got to get there, right? So a little preparation on a Sunday leading through the week can take care of a lot of the things that people grab for quickly to make the quick fix.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I will say again, when we think of our gorgeous pyramid, that adequacy piece, for me, adequacy from the most foundational aspect is anything you can enjoy, anything that's accessible to you will help from an adequacy perspective. So having enough fuel, no matter what that fuel is, certainly is going to be a foundation. And moving up from there, if it's accessible, available to you, certainly at our main meals, thinking about when we can incorporate some of those whole foods like you're talking about are also going to be beneficial from a general health perspective. And we're going to talk about in a little bit the nutrient timing piece of it all, where if you're someone who's really looking forward to incorporating some of those quicker grab and go foods, there is a space that actually works quite optimally for that. So there's certainly room for both. But if it's accessible to you to meal prep and prepare foods in that way, absolutely happy to encourage that. Gorgeous. So we've talked a lot about adequacy and hydration. We've talked about balance when we think of how we balance our food groups into these performance plates. So our bottom two layers of our pyramid have been covered. Now we want to fuel adequately, hydrate adequately in a balanced way as consistently as possible. So it doesn't have to look like 7 out of 7 days of the week, but as consistently as we can do any of these habits, the most benefit that we can have. So adequate fueling, adequate hydration in a balanced way, most of the time is where we're going to see our foundation really lie from a sports nutrition perspective. And when we think of those benefits, we're hoping to get enough energy, mental clarity, muscle building and growth, recovery, injury risk reduction. This is really what's going to drive some of those things. And when we start getting to the top of the pyramid, we have other aspects that are also important, but are likely going to be slightly less important than these foundational pieces. So we have our foundation primarily. Getting into the top of our pyramid, we have something called nutrient timing. And essentially what that means to most sports dietitians is timing our nutrition around things like our practice or our games to get the most benefit out of it. So when I think of nutrient timing, I think of 3 major important time periods, and that's before exercise, during exercise, and after exercise. And when I think of what food groups we might want to be focusing on at these times, we're primarily going to be looking at our carbohydrates and our protein to a lesser extent. So if we're about 1 to 2 hours before a game, a workout, a practice, going for something that might be a combination of moderate carbohydrates and moderate proteins might be the direction that we want to go. So we have a little bit of both to support our energy levels and support our muscles throughout that practice and throughout that particular day. But as we move closer to practice, we want to start shifting away from our protein and closer to our simple carbohydrates. And simple carbohydrates are going to be important for us as athletes, because if you can think back to when we were talking about immediate energy and sustained energy carbohydrates, if we are 30 minutes before a practice or a game, we're probably going to be wanting that immediate energy. We want energy quickly. We want to top off our fuel stores to power us through a game, to give us that last bit of energy. So that's where our focus primarily comes to simple carbohydrates, to provide us that immediate energy. And simple carbohydrates are mostly going to be carbohydrates without fiber. So they are going to look like things like our Welch's fruit snacks, our Go-Go squeezes, our chewy Cliff bars. It could look like pretzels. It could look like a sports drink, like a Gatorade or a Powerade. It could look like Cinnamon Toast Crunch. So all these carbohydrate sources are going to give our body energy really quickly. So if we're 30 minutes before a game or closer, we really want to think about which one of these carbohydrates tastes the best to us. Do we want to eat to make sure that we feel like our fuel stores are topped off and ready for exercise? That being said, whenever we talk about anything with sports nutrition, but certainly pre, during, and post-workout fueling, something I want you to keep in mind is that whatever works best for you is always going to be something that's really important. So I'm going to talk about general recommendations, what we typically see. If you're someone who has a superstition and tolerates something really well that might not be on one of these slides or may not fit within our guidelines, that's absolutely okay as well. What we do say is no nutrition, like NEW nutrition, on game days. So if you are thinking about giving something different a try, playing with your pre-workout, intra-workout, and post-workout fueling, I really encourage you to try that on a practice day, where if something does end up not sitting well in our stomach or we don't feel our best, it isn't going to matter quite as much as making sure that we can perform in that peak performance, optimal performance on game day. So that is my caveat, that these are our general recommendations, are combinations of carbohydrates and protein. For example, that could be something like a Cliff Bar. It could be a smoothie with a protein source like a protein powder or a yogurt or a milk. That could be an Uncrustable or a peanut butter and jelly. That could look like oatmeal with peanut butter and a banana. So lots of different ways to achieve this combination of carbohydrate and protein. And certainly this slide is not exhaustive. There are 100 ways to do this. So finding the way that tastes the best and works the best for you in numerous different ways is absolutely something I encourage you to explore. But as we get closer to our game, our practice, our workout, we want to drop off that protein component and really ensure that we're starting to shift toward those quick energy carbohydrates. So our, again, applesauce pouches, our carbohydrate or energy chews, or our fruit snacks, our sports beverages, anything like that, to ensure that we get energy to our muscles as quickly as possible when we're going to need to use it pretty quickly. So those are our pre-workout guidelines.
That's great. The comment and the question, the comment is, I like how you've talked about what's available and what's accessible. Right, that makes sense to me. A little bit kind of flies in the face of my earlier comment, but that's a good thing that we go through a process in this conversation. So there's that, but the other thing is that, I think what I'm hearing too is that it's much more important to find something that works for you. That's that individual, what works for you, as opposed to having nothing. Right. So that's when you talk about adequacy and being at that foundational level. If you're skipping some of these steps, like I think it's really common for certain sports, and my greatest experience is in football, where they're eating about 4 hours before a game. So we're talking about not workouts, but we're talking about competition. And then there's nothing else, in that 1 to 2 hour, that 30 minute before. and then in a lot of cases, not at halftime as well, and so, it's something about being accessible and available to you during those stages that you have access to, that you have the resources to be able to get, and so that you're not being, emptied on those, topping off your stores. That's a line that I heard you say is really important, that if you have a 2 to 3 hour sustained competitive period, that's not just physical, it's emotional, it's mental, it's very taxing to your nervous system. If you're not topping off those stores at some of those stages leading up to, and even during, I'm sure you're going to talk about during at some point, I think that's something that really needs to be drawn out here, because I feel like that's a significant gap, especially below college, but even in college athletics, but in the high school levels, I think there's a gap in that.
I love that you brought that up, and to give some time to like a game day schedule. And that's pretty similar to what I've seen in college. It takes our body time to digest and send a lot of blood flow to our stomach and our intestines to digest a large meal. So having that last meal before a game that may look something like, one more slide, we're going to get there, like this lovely 3 to 4 hours before a game, typically works pretty well. That's an amount of time that we can, again, digest all of this beautiful food, whether that is, again, pasta, potatoes, whatever it may be. Again, it's a little bit lighter from a fiber perspective, which means it's a little bit easier and faster to digest with a lower amount of fruits and veg here. So this is a relatively good example of 3 to 4 hours before a game, what we might want a plate to look like. And then, like you're mentioning, there tends to be this gap where we're needing time to adequately digest this food and want to start to shift to things that are a little bit easier to digest, things that might top off our fuel stores. So in my ideal world, this might be 3 to 4 hours before. We might stop for a snack that looks something like a Cliff Bar or an Uncrustable in that 1 to 2 hours before, depending on, again, what the individual athlete tolerates best. And then right before our game, or maybe right before we're starting to warm up, perhaps having something like a Gatorade or some carbohydrate chews to get that last boost of energy would be my ideal kind of 4 hours before a game fueling strategy. So I'm glad that you brought up that timeline specifically, because it's something that, particularly in college and pro athletics, we see repeated time and again, where we have that, again, 4-ish hour meal before, and then often have a lot of individual variation between what those next, again, 3-4 hours look like after a meal. So that is gorgeous. Any pre-workout questions?
No.
Alrighty. So following our pretty similar logic to what we might be looking at 30 minutes before, these easy to digest, quick carbohydrate sources, we are going to continue that trend when we think of what we might tolerate best within a workout or a game or a practice. And sticking to simple carbohydrates during these periods follows that, again, same logic, is that typically it'll be the easiest and the quickest to digest. So if we're within a game, we want that energy pretty much as quickly as possible. And that will all rely on our simple carbohydrates. And I've picked out a couple of these examples from the prior slides specifically, just because I wanted to elaborate on that idea of finding out what works best for you. Generally, I find that athletes who are maybe just wanting to start experimenting with fueling within a workout may try things like a fluid first. I love Gatorades or Powerades or our carbohydrate containing fluids, because they're kind of that triple threat. We have fluids that can help with getting adequate hydration. We have carbohydrates that will be quick to digest and absorb, particularly because they're in a liquid form. And we'll also have electrolytes, which we won't talk about too much in this presentation, but are also a aspect of hydrating, particularly for intense practices or games. So that is a recommendation I have. If you're someone who's just starting out, or maybe historically feels like they're not sure what has worked for them within practices or games, that's something that I think is even just taking a sip or two to see how you tolerate it, to see how it goes for you, might be a place to start. and other options. Again, there are millions, but other options I've seen used really frequently by athletes I've worked with have been things like fruit snacks or carbohydrate chews, or things like go-go squeezes, because they're easy, they're portable, they're shelf stable, so you can keep them in your backpack for pretty much as long as you need, not forever, but a pretty long time, and they still will be totally fine to eat right before your game or during. So these
Can I
are some
ask
of
a
the options.
question
Yeah.
here on this one? So, you said carbohydrate chews. I think that's something that I've seen quite a bit. There's a couple different ways of doing that. Talk to me though about, I don't know, but I've heard some just honey in general. Is that an option? It's hard to manage, I know that, but I've heard people that either honey or pickle juice, as these are two things within a hard workout, within a competition, those being two things to go to. There's the accessibility piece to it, but I'm just more kind of curious because you hear those more like, oh, you just need some pickle juice, you just need some honey.
Yep. Those are great options. So honey will absolutely be a simple carbohydrate. Anything that's a source of, again, kind of simple sugars like honey, I don't know, honey, regular sugar, whatever, is going to serve that same function. So honey is a great example of something that's pretty much the same, essentially, from a nutrition perspective as like a thing of carbohydrate choose from Gatorade. The other thing is, again, Welch's fruit snacks are pretty much the same thing as a, endurance carbohydrate chew branded package, which is often why I like kind of bringing up that spectrum where they're
Yep.
all doing the same things, perhaps at different price points. So honey
Yep.
is absolutely one. I know Honey Stinger is a brand that I've used really frequently in athletes that also falls into that category as well, predominantly because it relies on honey to provide that carbohydrate element to its products. But yes,
Okay. Yeah.
honey
I'm
certainly
familiar with
falls
that
into
one.
the
Yeah.
carbohydrate bin. Pickle juice is a little bit different,
Yeah.
primarily because we tend to see that used most often from like a cramp relief perspective,
Okay.
because
So it's
of
electrolyted. Is that ish?
partially ish. Pickle
Okay.
juice typically does have salt, which is an electrolyte. The benefit theoretically that some may see from it is also that it's really acidic. And that's where we see some of that theoretical benefit lie. Like if we're someone who is cramping immediately, I've seen pickle juice used, I've seen mustard used because it's also that acidic food item. Potentially, it's also kind of portable in packets. So those have certainly have function, not necessarily in the way of carbohydrates. If you wanted to have like a regular pickle, that would have carbohydrates in it probably, but the juice in and of itself isn't going to be the same amount of carbohydrates as something like a Gatorade or a fruit snap
Gotcha.
typically, but it does have some function and some evidence behind it when it comes to shortening the duration of cramps, although the evidence is a little bit mixed, but some people have really positive experiences with it. That's a great question and a fun,
I've
again, pickle
I've
juice
never
is
pushed it.
fun.
Yeah, I've never pushed it in my situations. It's been one of those things you hear in the back of your ears from maybe the parents, the stands, the different folks that have an opinion on some of this stuff, and I just was curious about it.
Yep, yeah. Pickle juice and mustard are the two things that I've used from that acetic acid
Yeah.
perspective that, again, may shorten a muscle cramp, or some individuals have really positive experiences with it. The other side of it that you're kind of mentioning is if we're in the middle of a game, is pickle juice or mustard something that's going to be tolerable to ingest? And that might depend on the person. I've had athletes that are like, keep that mustard as far away from me as possible. And I have other athletes that are totally fine with it or are willing to power through potentially if it reduces their cramping even by a couple minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that cramping thing is I mean, when it hits and takes a hold of an athlete, I mean, it seems obviously early in seasons when they're not as conditioned and trained and whatnot, that's when it happens. And obviously temperature has a lot to do with it, we know, and exertion. But when it does hit, it's hard to recover from within a game. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, certainly that hydration aspect, both from fluids like water and that hydration plus electrolyte component from things like Gatorades, Powerades. There's a million sports beverages on the market. Certainly serves as a foundation to hopefully prevent it from happening. And in the moment, those acidic components like our mustards and pickle juice potentially can, again, bring us back from the edge potentially. So I love that. Both of those strategies can be used in different ways. Gorgeous. So that is our pre-workout, our during workout fuel. And if you've noticed all of my slides about fueling before and after practices, say sandwiching, and that is both a play on words. As a dietitian, I have to do that. And it's going to play a role in how we think about what we're fueling with post-workout. So we've talked about at the beginning, an hour or two before, we want to be focusing on that combination of carbs and protein, some carbs, some protein. As we move towards exercise within the hour, within 30 minutes, we want to start to shift to primarily our simple and quick carbohydrates. We want to continue that through our game, practice, or workout. And then to cap off our bout of exercise, we want to shift back to that carbohydrate and protein combination. So if we made a sandwich, we would have our carbohydrate and protein bread on top for an hour or two before a workout. We'd start to shift to our simple carbohydrates in the middle, the proverbial meat of that sandwich. And then at the end of a workout, again, we want to have that second layer of sandwich bread being another snack of carbohydrate and protein combination. And this serves two functions similarly to when we first talk about our macronutrients mini slides ago, is that we want carbohydrates to replenish our energy and replenish our energy stores after we've used them during, again, a practice or a game. And we want that secondary component of protein to serve that muscle support, that muscle recovery. We have relatively strong evidence that consistent protein intake throughout the day can support muscle recovery and lead to reduced recovery times after exercise. So both components serve really, really important functions in exercise and muscle recovery. And those can look like examples like our chocolate milk. Again, chocolate milk is kind of another post-workout triple threat. It has carbohydrates from the sugar, it has fluids, and it will have protein from the dairy and the milk. That could be a smoothie with a protein component like a yogurt or a protein powder, our carbohydrates as our fruits, and again, a liquid as a fluid. We could do things like we could do a kind protein bar, so a protein bar that also has carbohydrates, or a protein bar and a banana and a bag of pretzels, whatever it may be. We could do a literal sandwich, so having a carbohydrate component like the bread, a meat or some other protein component, as well as a cheese and perhaps even a little bit of color or fruit and veg in there if it appeals to us. So lots of different ways to achieve this combination. These are some snacks to do them with. If you're able to have one of our performance plates sit down for a full meal after exercise, that is also highly encouraged. And for many athletes I work with, there might be a, hour, 2-hour delay in between the end of a game and the time that they get home, or the amount of time it takes to talk with their coach and then drive to the restaurant they may be meeting at for a team dinner. So having grab and go snacks, shelf stable snacks accessible to shorten that window before we shorten that window until we can eat again, I think can be really useful. But if we are someone who's going to go right from a practice home for dinner or something like that, that can also meet a lot of these criteria. But certainly using our snacks liberally when we need them and when they work well for our schedule.
This is great.
Any questions about post-workout?
I think post-workout is something that, a lot of people hear about the value of chocolate milk. That's gotten down into, even the high school levels. And there's always a function of accessibility with that, because you've got to keep it cold, right? So athletes showing up and keeping their chocolate milk to the end of a workout is difficult. So that's got to be something that the institution is able to help them with, whether that's storage or they provide it in general. So I think that's one thing. But I think aside from places that are able to do those things, like you said, the shelf ready stuff that an athlete can have for themselves. I think that's often skipped. I mean, I've seen so many practices where people are just, leaving without anything. And, there's not that kind of immediate post-workout fueling. It's going to be after the drive. It's going to be later at night. It's going to be at dinner. It's going to be, it could be 2 hours later, like you said, and to not have that kind of immediate replenishment it's just, when you talk about stacking little wins, that's the opposite. That's stripping little victories away from you, and those add up over time.
Absolutely. And yes, I love what you're mentioning, that ability to have shelf stable things sitting in your backpack. If you are fine with some like room temperature chocolate milk, some brands like Horizon, which is on here, some of the Fairlife like miniature bottles can be shelf stable. So certainly something that's worth checking your label or giving a Google, because leaving it out if it's not shelf stable is not going to go well, most likely. But there are a few brands that, if you don't mind that it's not refrigerator cold, can sit in your backpack. But you're right that the majority of different protein shakes and things like that do need to be refrigerated. So finding brands that you like the taste of and that might be shelf stable could be a fun exploration. Or if refrigeration is not something that is nearby, returning to some of those options again, like our bars or our fruit or our pretzels or things like that, or even something like a tuna, if we can tolerate it, that doesn't need to be refrigerated, might be better options because they don't need a refrigerator. They can sit in your backpack, whatever it may be, for, again, not forever, but for quite a while. Mm-hmm. But that is a great thought. All right. So we have done the whole workout and game fueling sandwich. We talked about beforehand, we talked about during, we talked about after. And that is the 3 areas where we think about nutrient timing. Timing our snacks or our fuel around exercise. So that brings me to our last element of our pyramid, which we're not going to talk about too much today because this could be a 4-hour lecture about different types of supplements, ones that we find are evidence-based, ones we don't see that quite as much with. But I did want to take a little bit of time just to talk about supplement safety, regardless of what supplement we're hoping to use. Because supplement safety is something that is really, really important, particularly for my athletes in the NCAA or that are being drug tested regularly, and want to make sure that, again, they have that availability. They're not failing a drug test by taking a supplement they're not sure what's in. So supplements and supplement safety is something that is near and dear to my heart. Again, if you're an NCAA athlete, the NCAA guidelines will be something that you are required to follow, and I recommend chatting with a sports dietitian at your university that may have a better handle on those. We won't go into them too much because I know we're talking to both athletes that may be in the NCAA, but may also be at the high school level or otherwise. So for all athletes, I recommend always looking for third-party tested supplements. And what that means is that there has been a third party, so another company that has come in and essentially verified that all of the things on the supplement facts panel are true, that the amount of what they say is supposed to be in the product is in there, that there's nothing that they don't say is in the product that is in the product and shouldn't be, that the manufacturing practices are safe and are clean, so there's not, dust or other things that are coming from a facility that is not the cleanest in your product, and in the right amounts. So that doesn't seem like a very high bar, but the supplement industry is largely unregulated. So third-party testing is really the best way to ensure that your supplement is safe, and ensure that your supplement, if you're complying with the NCAA or other guidelines, actually will comply with some of those guidelines based on what's in it, or if what's in it is what says it's in it and it complies with those guidelines, that gives you the most likely and the highest chance that supplement is actually safe. There are a few different third-party testing companies. I've highlighted 2 on the right side of this slide, and that's predominantly because these 2 are often used in sport. One is NSF certified for sport, and the other one is informed choice for sport. So these are 2 labels you may see on either the side of a container, you may see on the website, that indicate that whatever supplement you are looking at has been third-party tested, and you can ensure that it's safer than a product that isn't third-party tested. So again, I know that seems like maybe not the highest bar, that we're actually accurately labeling supplements and they're not having anything in them that shouldn't be in there. But there was a study that I reviewed probably last year where they had a random sampling of 30 supplements. So they took 30 supplements and they tested them by some of these guidelines. Is what it says supposed to be in there in the amount that it says it's supposed to be in there? Is there anything that shouldn't be there that is in there? And are these supplements manufactured with good manufacturing practices? And they found about 16 out of 30, so a little bit more than half, didn't comply with some of these statements. So third-party testing is really, really important, particularly for my athletes that need to follow guidelines for their organization. We cannot guarantee that a product is safe or, again, even has what's in the label without some level of third-party testing, typically because of how the supplement industry is regulated as a whole. So whatever you're interested in taking, I highly recommend looking for a third-party tested version of it, particularly with one of these labels like NSF or informed choice for sport. So that is my number 1 supplement safety tip. In general, both of these websites have search functions. So if you want to look up whether a supplement is certified by one of these organizations, those tools are absolutely at your disposal. Or again, connect with a sports dietitian who can review all of your supplements for you from both a third-party testing perspective, but also from the second aspect I've highlighted that we call efficacy. So whether or not a supplement works, we want our supplements to be safe first and foremost, but we also want our supplements to work for you for whatever purpose and whatever goals that you have. And that can really depend on several things. So to make a supplement effective, that means that it needs to, again, be appropriate for your goals. So it needs to do the thing that you're hoping it does for your goals, so individualized to your goals. We need to make sure the dosage, so how much of whatever supplement we're taking is enough to create that effect, so enough to make it effective. And then we also need to ensure that the timing of taking that supplement, perhaps that might be before exercise, that might be after, that might be, it doesn't matter, and you can take it anytime during the day. All of those bases are covered in addition to some other aspects to make sure that the supplement that you're taking is actually effective for what you want it to be doing. So again, connecting with a sports dietitian can be a way to ensure that whatever supplement you're choosing to take is both safe and effective for you and what you're looking for it to do.
This is a question, that for clarity. So the supplement could be anything from your Flintstone vitamin that you may have started taking as a little kid, right, that your parents gave you, all the way to any powder substance that you're putting in, a shake, what protein, creatine, whatever the case may be. Like, and I know there's a range in between, but it's not limited to, certain things. Like it's pretty inclusive. If it's outside of a whole food, or a packaged food, I should say too. I mean, it could be in the supplement category. Is that your take?
Absolutely. And just for clarity, on my next slide, I have here supplements can be, I could have filled this slide with, 300 different things, certainly. But the most common ones that I see athletes use and choose for numerous reasons are vitamins and minerals. So that could be a multivitamin. That could also be a specific, we call it like single nutrient vitamin. So for example, this vitamin D that's on the right side, that could be with lab testing. We notice that we have insufficient vitamin D levels or something like that, and we may be prescribed by a doctor or otherwise a single nutrient supplement. So that would be considered a supplement. Most of our single nutrient supplements are typically, of our spectral supplements, relatively safer. Typically, there's some degree of third-party testing as well. Not always NSF or informed choice, but usually one of the brands that we think of. Caffeine is actually also considered a supplement by the NCAA. Even though we don't always think of it as such, that could be caffeine in coffee, but it could also be caffeine in something like a multi-ingredient pre-workout. So a caffeinated pre-workout that might also contain other aspects. So caffeine is considered a supplement. All of our protein powders, whether it's Muscle Milk or Optimum or otherwise, are considered a supplement, as well as some of our more maybe typical supplements or the things that we may think of like creatine, beta-alanine, things like tart cherry juice, beet juice, and black currant juice are all considered supplements. I will say that things that are considered, like you mentioned, kind of whole foods or packaged foods like tart cherry juice will follow the guidelines for food and not the guidelines for supplements. So that's kind of the only exception to our third-party testing, is that if it's considered a food, like if you bought tart cherry juice at the store, that doesn't necessarily need to have a third-party testing certification because it tends to follow the guidelines of a food source rather than a supplement source. But there are, again, numerous supplements. These are ones that I see most often. But I love that you asked that question about what are we really defining as a supplement? What do we think of as a supplement? And these, I think, are, again, kind of give us a good foundation of what we typically see and may not think of as a supplement, like caffeine or sometimes protein powder.
That's great.
And then the last thing I wanted to highlight on this slide to tie in that third-party testing element is if you look at this tiny arrow on my right side, you'll see this small little blue label, and that is actually the NSF certification logo. So that essentially is telling us that this product, it's Clean Athlete Creatine, has been NSF certified, it's been third-party tested, versus other creatines that may be on the market may not have those assurances. So again, third-party testing is going to be our number one tip for supplement safety, and extending from that, ensuring that the supplements that you're taking are actually working for what you're hoping them to achieve in the dose and at the time that's creating an effective supplement. So that's pretty much all I have about supplements today. Again, this could be a 45-minute presentation about just supplements in themselves. I highly recommend chatting with a sports dietitian if you're thinking about taking supplements or you just want to ask questions about what supplements might be right for you. And that is going to conclude our Sports Nutrition Foundation's presentation for today.
It's awesome. I appreciate it a ton. And if you're a coach watching this or getting a chance to understand a little bit about what we're talking about here, and they would like you to visit with their team, their organization, whether that's, team and parents or just team in general, we want to make that happen. If that's a possibility to connect you with them. I assume too, though, that if individual athletes are also, you have looking at their nutrition plans, you've looking at their supplement plans, and you've really tried to break that down, and you've worked with some individual athletes. That's something that could be done as well. So, whether that comes back through me or contact Kristen directly, I think that could be something that the people who are getting a chance to take this in could really benefit from. What I know is that, I coached for a long time, over 20 years, mostly at the collegiate level, a little bit at the high school level. And I saw a lot of things that you talked about done in part. A lot of things that you were discussing done here and there, and when you talk about in the pyramid consistency and adequacy, I feel like there was a lot of gaps in my time of coaching in terms of that. And my role as a coach isn't necessarily to direct those things, but it's to lead them to those answers, right? And lead them to those solutions. And so, that role is just as important as anything else you're training an athlete for, whether that's the mental game, the drill aspects of it, there's the fueling and the recovery aspect that hits, the foundational pieces that you're talking about. That's still my role as a coach, even though I don't have the expertise like you do in this area. And then I think of it too as a parent. I raised 3 athletes in high school, multi-sport athletes that all went on to play college athletes or college sports. And what I know about what I failed at as a parent is so many things. I had more gaps, in my own kids when I think about listening to your presentation for them, rushing from practice to practice, and what are we trying to do in between? What are we doing prior to? What are we doing? I was a big believer of making sure that we always had the core meals, but I don't know is that the focus of the plates were the right way. I don't know is that we were doing a good job in between activity. I don't know is that we were doing a great job from a recovery standpoint with that. And so as a parent, boy, that's a lot to put on parents of busy kids with busy lives. But if you just spend a little time growing the kids' understanding so that they can take some ownership, and you partner on that a little bit, I think you can do a lot of good for those athletes. And so what are we? You led with something that was really important. The slide here says to peak performance, but one of the things is availability by not being injured, not being out, not having that whole circle of issues from headaches to, to soreness to, all the issues that can come from being dehydrated, being undernourished, and under, fueled for your performance, for your practices. So I think that those are, a lot of times people are after the peak of it, but we skip the foundation on our way to this mental aspect of peak. So I love it. It's great presentation, great information. And, there's a lot of places that this can benefit.
Absolutely. I'm happy to always chat. Certainly, if anyone is interested in more sports nutrition content or a little bit more tailored content to a specific sport, absolutely reach out to Brad. He can connect us both and we can expand upon that. Again, to your credit, Brad, when you think about fueling your kiddos or, again, setting that example for athletes, that first slide we talked about what impacts food decisions certainly comes into play of, again, time, attention. We all have very busy lives. If I can make a recommendation for anyone watching these slides, is to think about one area that we might have talked about today and start there. And then really build on that in the future. But if there's one area that you're like, ooh, you know what, I've never had that post-workout snack, right? Constantly have that 2-hour drive in between a practice and getting home. Thinking about where we can start and honing in on one aspect to just explore and try out what might work for you and build upon that foundation regardless of what it might be.
That's great. Awesome. Well, thank you again. I appreciate it. And we'll look forward to working with more people with this.